and welcome back to Risk Management. Today's topic is Inferior Data Part 3. We'll be talking about the risks of extrapolation, taking a known set of results for a certain specific sample population, and from that inferring results for a broader subject or a broader group of people. An example of this we'll see is animal studies. Do animal studies, and studies on rats, mice, rabbits, goats, whatever, predict for same study results in human beings? And that's something we'll have to look at as one example. There are others, and today is really sort of a mop-up work of issues related to inferior study design. Starting in the next class, we'll turn to a much broader topic of observational studies, looking at particular studies that are not randomized or not experimentally controlled, or both, and then seeing if we can actually still gain some causal knowledge from them. So that's where we're headed. All of what we're looking at is inferior data gathered from inferior experimental designs or non-experimental design studies than RCTs, randomized controlled trials. Okay, let's get started for today. What I want to emphasize is that we have to be cautious about extrapolating experimental or non-experimental conclusions in science. Here's a nice little graph of carbon dioxide concentrations. You'll see on the vertical axis the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, and on the horizontal axis the year. And here you see a whole bunch of different models, estimates by computers of how much carbon dioxide we're actually going to have in the air in any given year. Notice how much variation there is in these different models by different scientists. Each one takes into account certain principles, concepts, assumptions, or measurements, and based on all of those, tries to come up with an estimate for the future. Extrapolation can be problematic, particularly where there's widespread guesswork or range involved in the potential likelihood of a certain outcome. And here you can see a very significant spread ranging from 500 up to 1,000, basically a twofold spread in what our experimental conclusions would be about carbon dioxide in 100 years from now. Let's turn really briefly to the word extrapolate so we understand what that means. To extrapolate means to estimate the value of a variable outside a known range from variables within a known range by assuming that the outside variable or value follows logically from the known values. In other words, we test something and we know something about a specific sample population or a specific setting or a specific set of conditions, and then we from there create the logical inference or jump that, oh, I could take these results and say something about a different circumstance, not something we actually studied within our scenario. That's where caution needs to be exercised, because by extrapolating conclusions of studies, we can run into trouble. Here's a couple of very minor examples, some of which we've seen before back when we talked about frequencies and probabilities and chance. And what we did in there was we gave this example of, let's say we wanted to know the average adult American male's height. And so what we did was we went and sampled NBA basketball players' heights randomly. You might say, well, you've done a random sampling of adult male basketball players' heights, and from that you came up with 6'8". And so it was randomized and a blinded study where it wasn't the researcher's bias about which NBA players to go look for. It must be a good study, and we can from there extrapolate that the average adult American male's height is 6'8". Of course, we all see the problem with that this sample population is not representative of all American males. Another example where this comes up frequently is in polling data. People will take exit polls, samples of people leaving the polling booths, asking them who they voted for. And then we get actual election results shortly thereafter. What Freeman and Blumenthal in two separate studies in 2004 showed was that the actual time of day matters for when you conduct your sample. Democrats and Republicans go to polls at different times during the day, as it turns out. And as a result, if you conduct your exit poll too early or too late or too middle of the day, and it's not representative throughout, you will skew your polling data based simply on the time of day, a confounder that most people don't think of. But if we extrapolate from our sample polling to the broad actual exit polling, we can make mistakes. Another example of where extrapolated conclusions can be problematic is when we're dealing in issues of how we describe the results of a study. And so we might start with certain results and have certain findings, but then we get a little exuberant about what we found, and we globalize the importance of the findings of a study to a context that might not be appropriate. Here's an example that came up using violent video games. Anderson and Dill in 2000 did a study where they looked at short-term relationships between aggression and video game violence. More than 200 college students played either a violent or non-violent video game. These are older games and dated. One was called Wolfenstein 3D, the other was Myst, one a violent video game, one not. I don't even remember which one's which, it's been so long. But the games had similar difficulty levels, so you could rule out frustration as a cause of aggression in the studies by randomizing and having students play one game or the other. They played the game 3 times in 2 separate sessions about a week apart. And after the students played the games, they had the opportunity after 3 times to play another game in which they could set up a blast noise that their opponent would hear if the opponent lost, almost like a triumphant victory, see, I gotcha type of blast noise that would set up. Here's what they found in that study, that those who had played the violent video games set the noise blast to last longer than others who had not won and who had not played the violent video games. And the researchers interpreted that blast noise as being a sign of aggression. Women, interestingly, displayed higher levels of hostility and aggression than did the men. They said, as a result of this, in testimony before the U.S. Senate on the impact of interactive violence in TVs and video games on children, that, quote, "We now know for a fact that playing a violent video game for even a short period of time increases aggressive behavior in the short term." Now, here's what's the problem with this. I don't object to the study's setup. I don't object to the fact that they found this blast as being of interest. But to describe blasting a horn as the same sort of aggression as physical violence, of shooting somebody or stabbing somebody or punching somebody or stealing things or doing some other sort of crime of turpitude, suggests that blasting a horn, just like honking a horn in a car, is a proxy or a gateway to violent behavior. We have extrapolated from fairly innocuous findings to fairly broad findings about violence. And so that extrapolation we need to take with a grain of salt and caution and understand what they meant when they used the word aggressive results in these findings. Aggression here was measured by honking a horn, not by stabbing someone or shooting someone. The same sort of thing can come up for concerns of extrapolation when we're dealing in studies where the results of causation are very nuanced. Remember back when we were talking about aspirin and heart attacks in the RCT, randomized controlled trial studies, we said that if we hadn't had so many people involved in the study, not as much statistical power as we had in the real studies, and if in addition to not having statistical power, we hadn't randomized and controlled the studies to rule out chance, bias, and confounders the way we did, we might not have found these nuanced effects. That was particularly the case in populations of healthy individuals taking aspirin, where it turned out that aspirin only had a preventative effect of heart attacks to the tune of 4 per 1,000 patients, as opposed to a more pronounced effect in populations of people who had already had heart conditions. So, one of the things that Pito notes here is that answering a question reliably is difficult, even with large-scale randomized trials of sample populations. It would be virtually impossible to do this without such studies. In other words, it's very, very tempting to extrapolate from certain observational studies that you're going to see in the next section when we talk about observational studies, or other inferior designs to larger populations. What Pito is saying is even with the best RCTs that science can buy, it's still often very hard to tease out nuanced causal effects, and probably impossible if you use an inferior study design, although many inferior studies claim to achieve such. Animal studies also are often thought to predict for humans, and yet when we look at animal studies, we often see that the prediction is not as good as one might hope. In looking at bioassays for cancer, studies that study cancer-causing agents in mice or rats, The predictive value of finding cancer as a result of some agent in a mouse study is only about 43% predictive for reciprocal studies in rats and vice versa. So less than half the time that something causes cancer in rats does it actually also cause cancer in mice. And when we're looking at particular organs such as liver cancer or kidney cancer or whatever, it drops to even 37%. So a very low likelihood that one predicts for the other. In another study, Enever and others in 1989, they found that the majority of chemicals lacking a statistical association with cancer in human beings in observational studies still test positive for cancer in rodents. So in other words, just because something tests positive in a human doesn't mean you'll find it in an animal model to also be true. Finally, in another study by Service in 2004, they found that over 99.9% of all animal studies of chemical compounds used in pharmaceutical drug manufacture rule out drugs as being effective. That is, when you test, and all testing usually starts with animal models for pharmaceuticals, 99.9% of all drugs don't work for animals. So they never make it to human testing phases, which come later in pharmaceutical testing processes. And yet, even for the 0.1% of drugs that actually do work for animals, only about 20% of those drugs also work for human beings. So animal models don't actually predict that well for humans. This can lead to fundamental errors in extrapolation if we get too excited about animal results and think that it tells us something about humans. Here's a case in point from Gina Kolata, an excellent reporter for the New York Times, who even made this mistake. She published on page 1 of the New York Times, above the fold, prominent, on May 3rd, 1998, that cancer had been cured by a researcher named Judah Folkman. And she quoted in there a very reputable source, James Watson, one of the discoverers of DNA, who said that Judah Folkman is going to cure cancer in 2 years. And so this, of course, was 1998. It's 2016 when I'm shooting this video, and we still have cancer, and it's still not cured. So what went on? How come she wrote this in 1998 that cancer was cured, which also got picked up by other magazines right after that? Here's Time Magazine, Cancer Done, U.S. News and World Report, A Mouse That Beat Cancer. The point was, these were animal studies, and Judah Folkman could cure cancer in mice. But when these cancers were attempted to be cured in human beings, he made a discovery about 7 years later, which is that human cancers are more complex and involve more mechanisms than these animal models he was working with. And some of the cancer cells operated in the way he understood from the mouse models, but others did not, and therefore he could not cure cancer as anticipated. And as a result, even 17, 18 years after this headline story came out in the New York Times that cancer was done, we still have cancer with us today in human populations. So again, animals, we shouldn't extrapolate their results in order to reach human conclusions. This is going to bring us to a sober cautioning note in all of this, which is you might understand from what I'm saying that maybe we should skip all the extrapolation and just move straight on to human studies all of the time and just get right down to business. Of course, here we have other concerns that crop up. It's not just a matter of doing the science, we also need to be ethical in doing the science. Nazis tested a lot of experimental things on human victims at Auschwitz and other concentration camps during World War II. And I suppose in some sense of it, their scientific studies really were gold standard in the sense of gaining scientific knowledge. They were, however, last place in ethics. There are studies that you could never imagine ever being approved by any ethics board that the Nazis did. We do have the results of those studies, and they have been incorporated into modern science, oftentimes by Jewish scientists, actually. But the condition that we have placed on that is that the Nazi scientists' names have all been removed from those studies so that they would gain no fame, repute, or credit for what they did. But here are some examples. I'm not going to run through them all, but examples of different Nazi science studies done, some randomized, back in Auschwitz in the 1940s. For example, in number 4 here, Dr. Mengele, the Doctor of Death, did twin studies where he would inject twins with various diseases, one with the disease and one he would be the control subject, to try to control for all confounders and see what was going on with a specific disease introduced to a particular human being, controlling even for genetic variation in humans. We do twin studies often among human populations, and they're very compelling for the reason that if we do a twin study, we're controlling for a lot of potential randomized variables that we need to take into account. But these sorts of studies would never be approved today. I bring this only up to say that we always need a cautionary note. Yes, it's important not to extrapolate. It's also important not to torture or execute anyone as a result of your scientific experiments. One last point I want to bring up is that, and this is just sort of an aside I'm throwing in because I don't have anywhere else to put it in my lectures, is that even if we're not extrapolating, even if we're not doing inferior studies and we're doing powerful, well-controlled, randomized RCT experiments, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be perfect at establishing causation. Even RCTs have a bit of inferiority in their design, and we know this, for example, from studies like this one by Diakinis, who's a Stanford scientist in 2005. He did a study where he took a fair coin, and depending on whether he placed heads up or tails up first, what he noticed is either way, whatever side of the coin came up first would tend to be the side that would come up on the flip 51% of the time. In other words, he found the coin to be biased in favor of whichever side was heads up. This was even taking into account the angle of the flip, the force that was used to apply, because they'd use a sort of a standard machine to flip the coin each time, the starting angle of the coin, and so forth. So all the variables that you think might affect the coin, even when taken into account, he found a bias in the coin's flipping. The only variable they didn't control for was air friction, so maybe that was the reason, but one never knows. The point being is that in the conclusion, even in a randomized trial, you can find slight variations, imperfections in the randomization that might add up and actually cause a problem, a confounder or a bias or a chance effect that actually will influence results. Sometimes these sort of chance results will not influence the overall effect, and sometimes they will. And we'll see examples of that where there tends to be greater influence when we get to financial risk analysis. Okay. That's it for today. What I wanted to leave you with was the basic punchline that we don't extrapolate experimental conclusions or observational conclusions. Extrapolation can be very, very haphazard and also very suspect if not done with utmost care. I look forward to hearing from you on the chat boards about your thoughts on extrapolation, and I'll see you in the next class.